Why did I ever think this was a good idea? That's the thought hammering my skull as I sit here, replaying how I ended up in this mess. My name's Juniper Elise Hawthorne, 29 years old, born and raised in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm a graphic designer by trade, the kind who spends too much time hunched over a laptop sipping overpriced coffee. I've got curly auburn hair that's always a little wild, green eyes that catch the light just right, and a habit of overthinking everything. Life up in the mountains was quiet, too quiet sometimes, so I figured a road trip would shake things up. Packed my Toyota RAV4 with camping gear, a cooler of snacks, and a playlist of indie rock, then pointed south toward Orlando, Florida. A solo adventure, just me and the open road. Sounded freeing, right? Truth is, I'd been itching to get out of Asheville for months. Work was a grind, my apartment felt like a cage, and I'd just gone through a breakup that left me raw. My ex, Theo, said I was too intense, whatever that means. So, I scrolled through camping blogs, stumbled on Orlando's Wekiwa Springs State Park, and thought, why not? Crystal clear springs, shady trails, a little slice of nature not too far from the city buzz. I pictured myself swimming, sketching by the water, maybe even sleeping under the stars without a care. Packed my tent, a sketchbook, and enough bug spray to fend off a swarm. Figured I'd camp a few nights, soak up some sun, and head back refreshed. Driving down I-95, I felt that first spark of excitement. The air got thicker, warmer, the landscape flattening out into endless pines and palms. Orlando's got this weird mix of tourist traps and hidden gems. Disney's just a stone's throw away, but Wekiwa Springs promised something wilder. I rolled into the campground late afternoon, the sun dipping low, painting everything gold. The ranger at the gate was a gruff guy, all sunburned cheeks and a lazy drawl, handing me a map with a half-hearted "stay safe out there." I nodded, grinning like an idiot, thinking this was my big escape from the everyday grind. The campsite was tucked off a winding dirt road, surrounded by live oaks dripping with Spanish moss. I picked a spot near the river, close enough to hear the water, but not so close I'd wake up soaked. Setting up the tent was a comedy of errors. I'm no pro, and the poles kept slipping out of my hands. By the time I got it standing, I was sweaty, swearing under my breath, and swatting at mosquitoes. Still, I felt proud, like I'd conquered something small. I built a little fire, the crackle mixing with the hum of cicadas, and cracked open a beer. The sky was clear, stars popping out one by one. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, you know? I'd heard Orlando could get rowdy, spring breakers, theme park crowds, but out here, it was just me and the woods. Well, me and a couple other campers scattered around. There was an older guy with a beat-up RV a few sites down, puffing on a cigar, and a young couple giggling over a card game nearby. Normal folks, I figured. I waved, they waved back, all friendly-like. Nothing horror-worthy about that, right? I leaned back in my folding chair, sketching the riverbank in the firelight, letting the quiet sink in. Felt like I'd finally dodged life's chaos for once. But something nagged at me, even then. Maybe it was how dark it got so fast, the trees swallowing up the last of the daylight. Or how the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I shook it off. City girl jitters, I told myself. I'd camped plenty back home in the Blue Ridge Mountains. This was no different. Just a little getaway, a chance to breathe. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and drifted off to the sound of the river. Should have been perfect. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to that ranger's tone, like he knew something I didn't. Or how the couple's laughter cut off so sudden, like someone flipped a switch. But nah, I was too busy playing adventurer, too caught up in my own head to notice the first cracks forming. By morning, I'd start to see this place for what it really was. And man, was I in for a disturbing wake-up call. Waking up that first morning, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My back ached from sleeping on the ground, and the tent was a sauna. Humid Florida air seeping through every seam. I stumbled out, blinking at the sunlight bouncing off the river, and muttered, "Well, this is why coffee exists." The fire was dead, just a pile of ash, and my cooler had leaked melted ice all over my stuff. Great start, right? I rummaged for a granola bar, trying to shake off the grogginess, when I noticed something off. The campground was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just this thick, heavy stillness that made my skin prickle. I chalked it up to early morning vibes and decided to hike to the springs. Grabbed my backpack, stuffed in water and a towel, and hit the trail. The path was gorgeous, twisting through ferns and cypress trees, the air smelling like damp earth and pine. But about a mile in, I found this weird pile of rocks stacked up by the trail, kind of like a cairn but sloppy, uneven. Looked like someone threw it together in a hurry. I snapped a pic, thinking it'd make a cool sketch later, but it left me uneasy. Who'd bother doing that out here? Shrugging it off, I kept going, the springs calling my name. The water was unreal, clear as glass, shimmering turquoise. I waded in, letting the coolness wash away the sticky heat, and for a minute, everything felt right. Swam around, floated on my back, even laughed at myself for being such a worrywart. But then I saw this guy watching me from the shore. Tall, lanky, wearing a faded flannel despite the heat. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stared, hands in his pockets. I gave an awkward little nod, trying to be polite, but he turned and walked off into the trees. Creepy, sure, but not horror movie creepy. Yet, back at camp, I tried to fire up my stove for lunch, mac and cheese, the camping classic, but the damn thing wouldn't light. Kept clicking, no flame. I was cursing it out when the old guy from the RV strolled over, cigar still smoldering. Need a hand? He asked, voice raspy like he'd smoked his whole life. Name was Virgil, he said, and he got the stove going in 2 seconds flat. We chatted a bit. He was from Tampa, retired, liked the solitude. Nice enough, but he kept glancing at the woods, like he was expecting something to pop out. You hear anything weird last night? He asked. I hadn't, but his question stuck with me. The day dragged on, and I decided to explore more. Took a trail toward Rock Springs Run, figuring I'd stretch my legs. That's when I found the note, tucked under a stone near a bench, scribbled on a torn scrap of paper. Don't trust the water. No name, no explanation, just that. My stomach did a little flip. Was it a prank? Some local kid messing with tourists? I stuffed it in my pocket, telling myself it was nothing, but my brain was already spinning scary what-ifs. Like, what if the springs were contaminated? Or worse. By dusk, I was back at my site, cooking over the fire since the stove was still iffy. The young couple from the other site, Lila and Ezra, I'd learned, wandered over to say hi. They were from Miami, all tanned and carefree, sharing a beer with me. We swapped stories, laughed about dumb camping fails, and it felt normal. But then Ezra got quiet, staring at the river. You see that? He whispered. I followed his gaze. Nothing but dark water and swaying reeds. Thought I saw something move, he said, shaking it off with a laugh. Lila rolled her eyes, but I caught her glancing back too. Night fell, and I crawled into my tent, the note still burning a hole in my pocket. I couldn't sleep, kept replaying Virgil's question, Ezra's weird moment, that guy by the springs. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, and I swore the river sounded louder, like it was whispering something I couldn't catch. I told myself I was just paranoid. That solo camping always makes you jumpy. Maybe I'd head into Orlando tomorrow, grab some supplies, clear my head. But deep down, I knew something was starting to feel seriously disturbing, and it wasn't just my imagination playing tricks. Morning hit me like a slap, humid, sticky, and way too bright. I crawled out of my tent, rubbing sleep from my eyes, and froze. The fire pit was trashed, logs scattered, ash smeared everywhere, like something big had barreled through it. What the hell? I muttered, kicking at a splintered piece. No way that was wind or some raccoon. My gut twisted, but I tried to play it cool. Maybe Virgil's cigar habit got out of hand last night. Yeah, that's it. I grabbed my water bottle and headed to the river to rinse off, hoping to shake the creepy feeling crawling up my spine. The water looked different today, murky, with these weird oily swirls on the surface. I hesitated, that stupid note flashing in my head. Don't trust the water. Screw it, I thought, splashing my face anyway. But as I straightened up, I saw it, a shape in the trees across the river. Not the lanky guy from yesterday, but something else. Tall, hunched, moving slow between the trunks. My heart kicked up a notch. I blinked and it was gone. You're losing it, Juniper, I told myself, laughing it off, but my voice sounded shaky even to me. Back at camp, things got weirder. Lila and Ezra's site was empty, no tent, no gear, just tire tracks in the dirt. They'd been talking about staying another night. So where'd they go? I wandered over to Virgil's RV, figuring he might have seen something. His door creaked open before I even knocked, and there he was, eyes bloodshot, cigar unlit for once. "They left at dawn," he grunted. "Said they didn't like the vibe." He wouldn't look at me, just kept fiddling with a pocket knife. "You should think about heading out too, kid." His tone was off, tight, like he was holding something back. I brushed it off, but the day went downhill fast. Hiking another trail, I found more of those sloppy rock piles. 3 this time, spaced out like markers. Then there was this smell, faint at first, like rotting meat mixed with wet earth. Made my stomach churn. I kept moving, telling myself it was just swamp funk, but when I hit a clearing, I saw bones. Small ones, picked clean, scattered near a fallen log. Could have been an animal kill, sure, but they were arranged too neat, almost like a display. Horror crept in, cold and sharp. I wasn't alone out here. By afternoon, I was back at my site, nerves frayed. Decided to pack up early, maybe crash at a motel in Orlando instead. But as I stuffed gear into my bag, I heard it, a low, guttural hum. Not an animal, not the wind, something deliberate, coming from the woods. I froze, scanning the trees, and that's when I saw him again. The lanky guy from the Springs, standing maybe 50 yards off, staring right at me. Only now, his face looked wrong. Too pale, eyes too big, like they didn't fit his skull. My breath hitched, and he took a step closer. I bolted to my tent, fumbling with the zipper, heart slamming against my ribs. Inside, I grabbed my phone, 2 bars, thank God, and texted a friend back in Asheville. "Something's messed up here, might leave soon." The hum got louder, closer, and I peeked out the mesh window. He was gone, but the air felt electric, buzzing with something scary I couldn't name. Then my phone pinged, a reply, "Get out now." I laughed, bitter and shaky, thinking she was just being dramatic. But then I saw the shadow stretch across my tent. Not mine, not Virgil's. I yanked my knife from my bag, a little switchblade I'd brought just in case. Felt dumb holding it, but the weight steadied me. The hum stopped, replaced by this awful silence that pressed on my ears. I waited, sweat beading on my forehead, until I heard Virgil yell. Sharp, panicked, cut off mid-sentence. I unzipped the tent an inch, peering out. His RV door hung open, swaying in the breeze, but he was nowhere. Just that smell again, stronger, choking me. Everything screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just some weird camper or a bad trip. This was terror, real and breathing, closing in fast. And I was still stuck in the middle of it. I couldn't stay in that tent another second. My brain was screaming, "Move, Juniper, now." I grabbed my bag, knife still clutched tight, and bolted out into the dusk. The air hit me like a wall, thick with that rotting stench, and my eyes darted everywhere. Virgil's RV sat there, door flapping like a broken wing, but no sign of him. My legs shook as I sprinted toward the dirt road, heart pounding so hard I thought it'd bust out of my chest. Whatever was out there, it wasn't messing around, and I wasn't waiting to find out what it wanted. The woods blurred past me, oaks, moss, shadows twisting into shapes that made my skin crawl. I kept thinking about Lila and Ezra bailing at dawn, Virgil's warning, that damn note about the water. Should have listened, should have packed up yesterday. My boots slapped the ground, kicking up dust, and I swore I heard something behind me. Fast, heavy, crashing through the brush. Didn't look back. Couldn't. Just ran, lungs burning, toward where I'd parked by the ranger station. If I could get there, I'd be safe, right? Halfway down the road, I tripped. Classic horror move. I know. Caught my foot on a root and went sprawling. Bag flew out of my hands. Knife skittered into the dirt. I scrambled up, cursing, and that's when I saw it. Not the lanky guy, but something worse. Tall, hunched, skin like wet clay, eyes glowing yellow in the fading light. It was 20 yards off, loping toward me, all wrong angles and jerky moves. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a person, wasn't an animal. It was something scary, something that didn't belong here. I snatched the knife, left the bag, and ran again. The ranger station was close, lights flickering through the trees, a beacon in this nightmare. But then I heard tires squeal. A beat-up truck roared out of nowhere, cutting me off, and for a split second, I thought, great, now what? The driver's window rolled down. It was the lanky guy, face still off, grinning too wide. "Get in," he rasped, voice like gravel. No way in hell. I veered left, diving into the woods, branches clawing at my arms. Better the trees than whatever he was selling. The thing behind me let out this sound, half growl, half scream, and I felt the ground shake. It was gaining fast. I zigzagged, ducking under limbs, praying I'd lose it. My phone buzzed in my pocket, stupid thing picking now to work, but I couldn't stop. Sweat stung my eyes, and I tasted blood where I'd bit my lip. Then I saw the river ahead, dark and rushing. No time to think. I splashed in, water up to my knees, slipping on rocks. Figured it might slow that thing down, buy me a minute. It didn't. I heard the splash behind me, felt the current shift, glanced back. Those yellow eyes locked on me, closer now, cutting through the water like it didn't care. Panic clawed my throat. I waded faster, hit the far bank, and hauled myself up, soaked and shaking. The ranger station was 100 yards off. I could make it if I pushed. But then headlights flared again. That truck screeched onto a side path, blocking me. Lanky guy leaning out, still grinning. "You can't outrun it," he called, almost cheerful. I didn't answer, just bolted parallel to the river, legs screaming, knife useless in my hand. The thing roared behind me, a sound that turned my blood cold, and I knew this was life or death. Orlando's lights glowed faint in the distance, civilization so close, yet I was stuck in this horror show. The station loomed ahead, door cracked open, but no ranger in sight. I threw myself toward it, lungs on fire, praying I'd get there before they did. One of them, man or monster, was going to catch me, and I had no clue which was worse. All I knew was I had to keep moving, or I was done. I slammed into the ranger station door, shoulder first, and it gave way with a groan. Inside was dim, flickering fluorescent lights, a desk piled with maps, and a stale coffee smell. No ranger, no help, just me dripping river water on the floor, panting like a cornered animal. I spun around, knife up, expecting that thing, or the lanky guy, to barrel in after me. Nothing yet, just my own ragged breathing echoing back. I bolted the door, hands shaking so bad I could barely slide the lock. "Come on, Juniper, think," I hissed, scanning for a phone, a radio, anything to call for help. There was a landline on the desk, old school, cord tangled. I grabbed it, dialed 911, and got static. Tried again, same deal. My phone was soaked, screen black, useless. Panic clawed up my throat, but I forced it down. Found a back room, a storage closet with a rusty lockbox. Popped it open, jackpot, a flare gun and 2 flares. Loaded one, stuffed the other in my pocket, and crept to the window. Outside, the woods were dead quiet. No crickets, no wind. Just this awful, heavy stillness that screamed trouble. Then I saw him. The lanky guy, strolling out of the trees, hands swinging loose like he had all the time in the world. That grin still plastered on his face, wider now, showing too many teeth. Behind him, those yellow eyes glowed, low to the ground, circling slow. My stomach flipped. They were working together, hunting me like some sick game. I gripped the flare gun, heart hammering. Had to get out of here, but how? Front door was a no-go, and the back exit led straight into the woods, right into their playground. I made a call, a dumb one, looking back. Decided to sneak out the back, flare gun ready, and make a break for the main road. Orlando wasn't far. Someone had to be out there, right? I eased the door open, wincing at every creak, and slipped into the night. The air hit me, thick and sour, that rotting smell choking me again. Took 2 steps, then froze. Footprints in the mud. Not mine, not human. Too big, too deep, with claw marks. My mouth went dry. I'd misjudged this bad. A twig snapped, and I whipped around. The thing lunged, fast, a blur of gray and yellow, claws slashing air where I'd been a second ago. I fired the flare, a wild shot, and it streaked red across the sky, lighting up its face, jagged teeth, hollow sockets, a nightmare carved out of flesh. It shrieked, recoiling, and I ran, legs pumping, no plan, just terror driving me. Heard the truck rev somewhere close. Lanky guy wasn't done either. I veered toward the road, chest burning, flare gun empty but still in my hand like a lifeline. I hit pavement, sweet, solid asphalt, and saw headlights. A car, some late-night driver, screeched to a stop. I waved, screaming, "Help me." Guy rolled down his window, wide-eyed. An older dude, probably heading home from a bar. "Get in," he yelled, and I didn't hesitate. Dove into the passenger seat, slamming the door as he peeled out. Looked back. Those yellow eyes watched from the tree line, unblinking, and the truck idled nearby. Lanky guy's silhouette just sitting there, staring. My savior muttered, "What the hell was that?" I couldn't answer, just shook, adrenaline crashing hard. He dropped me at a gas station off I-4, stammering about calling the cops. I nodded, numb, and watched him drive off. Cops showed up later, took my story, tent left behind, Virgil gone, no trace of Lila or Ezra. They searched Wakiwa Springs, found nothing but my gear and those creepy rock piles. Said it was probably drifters or wildlife. I knew better. Back in Asheville now, I still see those eyes in my dreams, hear that hum. Should have stayed home, should have never trusted that damn water. Worst part? Found out later the ranger'd vanished too, same night I ran. Whatever's out there, it's still hungry, and I'm the one who got away, for now. I never should have left Chicago for that camping trip near Orlando. The memory of that night haunts me still, creeping into my dreams and jolting me awake in cold sweats. My name is Thaddeus Wayne Fletcher, though most people just call me Thad. At 32, I thought I'd seen enough of life to handle whatever came my way. Born and raised in the Windy City, I'd built a decent life as a freelance photographer, specializing in urban landscapes and architecture. My apartment walls were decorated with stark black and white images of skyscrapers and bridges, safe, solid structures of steel and concrete. Nothing like the wild unpredictability of nature. It was my college buddy, Rowan, who suggested the trip. "You need to get out of your comfort zone," he insisted during one of our weekly video calls. "Come down to Florida. We'll take my Honda CR-V out to the Ocala National Forest near Orlando. There's this secluded spot I found last year, absolutely pristine." I remember laughing at his enthusiasm. Rowan had always been the adventurous one, while I preferred the predictability of city life. Still, after a particularly brutal Chicago winter and a string of canceled photography gigs, the idea of warm sunshine and a change of scenery became increasingly appealing. The flight to Orlando was uneventful, though I couldn't shake a strange feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach during the descent. Rowan picked me up at the airport in his sleek silver Honda, the back already packed with camping gear. "You look like hell, Thad," he joked, clapping me on the shoulder. "Florida sunshine will fix that." I forced a smile and tossed my duffel bag onto the back seat, trying to ignore the disturbing sense that I was making a terrible mistake. Rowan's girlfriend Vanessa sat quietly in the passenger seat, offering me a small wave. I'd never met her before, only seen her in photos, and there was something about her tight smile that unsettled me. Orlando itself was a stark contrast to Chicago, all palm trees and pastel colors instead of steel and stone. As we drove through the city, Rowan pointed out attractions and landmarks with the excitement of a tour guide. "We'll hit Disney on the way back if you want," he offered. "Or Universal. They've got that new horror experience." I nodded absently, watching the urban sprawl gradually thin out as we headed northeast toward the forest. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the highway, and billboards advertising theme parks and roadside attractions gave way to dense vegetation and the occasional ramshackle gas station. Vanessa remained mostly silent during the drive, occasionally checking her phone or flipping through a dog-eared paperback. When she did speak, her voice was so soft I had to lean forward from the back seat to hear her. "It gets dark fast out there," she murmured at one point, not looking up from her book. "The forest swallows the light." Rowan laughed and reached over to squeeze her knee. "Don't mind Ness," he told me with a wink. "She grew up around here and loves to spook out-of-towners with local legends." But there was something in her eyes when she finally looked at me in the rearview mirror, a warning, perhaps, or resignation, that sent a chill down my spine despite the Florida heat. We stopped at a small general store on the outskirts of civilization to stock up on supplies. While Rowan chatted with the elderly cashier about fishing conditions, I wandered the aisles, grabbing extra batteries for my camera and a few protein bars. In the back of the store, near a rack of faded postcards, I noticed a bulletin board covered with missing person flyers. Most were yellowed with age, but a few looked recent, hikers and campers who had ventured into the forest and never returned. One in particular caught my eye, a young woman with familiar features who had disappeared just 3 weeks earlier. When I turned to point it out to Vanessa, I found her watching me, her face pale. "People get lost all the time," she said flatly. "The forest is bigger than you think." By the time we finally turned onto the unpaved Forest Service road that would lead to our campsite, the sun was setting, painting the sky in ominous shades of crimson and violet. The CRV handled the rough terrain well, but each bump and jolt seemed to amplify my growing anxiety. The trees pressed in close on either side of the narrow road, branches scraping against the windows like desperate fingers. Rowan was still chattering away about the excellent fishing and the natural springs we could swim in, but his words barely registered. All I could think about were those missing person flyers and the strange look in Vanessa's eyes. As we rounded a bend and the last sliver of sunlight disappeared behind the tree line, plunging us into premature darkness, I couldn't help but wonder if my name and face would someday end up on that bulletin board, another victim of whatever lurked in these woods. The first real warning sign came when we lost cell service. I'd expected it, of course. We were heading deep into the wilderness, but the sudden disconnection from the outside world hit me harder than anticipated. One minute I was scrolling through my email, the next staring at the no service indicator like it was a death sentence. Rowan noticed my expression and laughed. "Welcome to actual nature, city boy," he said, turning the CRV onto an even narrower path that I wouldn't have recognized as a road at all without the headlights illuminating it. "This is the real Florida, not that tourist trap crap they sell you in Orlando. This is authentic wilderness." As if to emphasize his point, something large darted across the path ahead of us, visible for just a second in the headlight beam before vanishing into the underbrush. None of us mentioned it, but I noticed Vanessa's knuckles turn white as she gripped the door handle. We reached the campsite well after dark, my car's headlights cutting through the dense forest like searchlights in a prison yard. Rowan seemed unfazed by the late arrival, expertly navigating the vehicle to a small clearing next to what he assured me was a beautiful spring-fed lake. "You'll see in the morning," he promised, killing the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming, broken only by the constant chorus of insects and the occasional distant splash from the water. The air felt heavy, saturated with moisture and the earthy scent of decomposing vegetation. As I stepped out of the CRV, my foot sank slightly into the soft ground, and something scurried away from the disturbance, something I couldn't see but could definitely hear. Setting up camp by flashlight wasn't ideal, but Rowan insisted we'd be fine. "I've done this a dozen times," he boasted, unloading tents and coolers from the car with practiced efficiency. Vanessa moved wordlessly beside him, her face ghostly in the harsh, artificial light. I tried to make myself useful, but city life hadn't prepared me for the complexities of tent assembly in near-total darkness. My frustration mounted as I struggled with poles and stakes, acutely aware of the vast, pressing darkness beyond our small circle of light. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the underbrush sent my pulse racing. "You're being paranoid," I muttered to myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, studied, by unseen eyes from the tree-line. Sleep eluded me that first night. The tent Rowan had lent me was high quality but unfamiliar, and every time I started to drift off, some new sound would jolt me back to alertness. The chorus of frogs and insects was expected, but other noises were harder to place. A series of low grunts that might have been a wild pig, a rhythmic scratching against a nearby tree, and once, heart-stoppingly, what sounded like distant laughter. I told myself it was just campers at another site, though Rowan had bragged that this spot was completely off the grid and no one else knows about it. Around 3 a.m., I finally gave up and unzipped the tent, desperate for some fresh air. The night outside was alive with shifting shadows and silver moonlight filtering through the canopy. The lake Rowan had mentioned gleamed like black glass, its surface occasionally broken by ripples from unseen movement below. As my eyes adjusted, I made out Rowan and Vanessa's tent about 20 yards away, dark and silent. Between our campsite and the water's edge, something caught my attention, a series of indentations in the soft earth that hadn't been there when we arrived. They resembled footprints, but were oddly shaped, too narrow and deep, with strange protrusions where toes should be. They led from the water directly to the back of my tent, then circled around to disappear into the dense underbrush. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the warm night air. Whatever had made those tracks had been standing right outside my tent while I lay awake inside. Morning brought no relief from my growing unease. I emerged from my tent to find Rowan already awake, whistling cheerfully as he stoked a small campfire. The footprints I'd seen in the night were gone, erased by the heavy dew that coated everything. When I mentioned them to Rowan, he shrugged it off. "Probably raccoons," he said dismissively. "Little bastards are curious." But raccoons didn't make tracks like that, and we both knew it. Vanessa emerged from their tent looking like she'd slept even less than I had, dark circles shadowing her eyes. She stared at the lake for a long moment before accepting the cup of instant coffee Rowan offered her. "We should leave," she said abruptly. "Today? Now." Rowan's reaction to Vanessa's suggestion revealed the first crack in his cheerful facade. "Don't start this again," he snapped, his voice carrying a warning edge I'd never heard from him before. They exchanged a loaded glance that told me this was a continuation of an earlier argument, one I hadn't been privy to. The tension between them was palpable, disturbing in its intensity. "Everything's fine," Rowan insisted, his smile returning too quickly as he turned to me. "Ness just had a bad dream. That's all. We're going to have an amazing day. I thought we'd hike over to the natural springs this morning, take a dip. The water's crystal clear. You can see right to the bottom." Vanessa said nothing more, but her eyes found mine, and the silent plea in them was unmistakable. Against my better judgment, I sided with Rowan. After all, we'd just arrived, and despite my unsettled night, the forest looked considerably less menacing in the morning light. The clearing was actually quite beautiful, ringed by ancient cypress trees draped with Spanish moss that swayed gently in the breeze. The lake sparkled invitingly in the sunlight, its surface broken occasionally by jumping fish. Even the air seemed fresher, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers rather than the vague rot I'd detected the night before. "Let's at least check out those springs," I suggested, trying to sound enthusiastic. "We can always head back to Orlando tonight if we want." Vanessa's face fell, but she nodded resignedly. As we prepared for the hike, I noticed her slip something into her pocket, a small folding knife that glinted briefly in the sunlight before disappearing from view. The hike to the springs took us deeper into the forest, away from our campsite and the relative openness of the lake. The trail was barely discernible, more animal path than human thoroughfare, and several times Rowan had to backtrack to find our way. The temperature rose steadily as the morning progressed, the air growing thick and difficult to breathe. Sweat soaked through my shirt, attracting clouds of tiny biting insects that seemed immune to the repellent we'd applied. Vanessa walked silently beside me, her eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. Once, she grabbed my arm suddenly, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Did you see that?" she whispered urgently. I followed her gaze but saw nothing except shifting patterns of light and shadow among the trees. "There's nothing there," Rowan called back to us, his voice tinged with irritation. "Come on, we're almost there." As we resumed walking, Vanessa leaned close to me. "This was where Lena disappeared," she murmured. "3 weeks ago, the girl from the flyer you were looking at." Before I could respond, a piercing bird cry echoed through the trees, so strange and human-like that all three of us froze in our tracks. The springs, when we finally reached them, were undeniably beautiful. A series of turquoise pools connected by small waterfalls, the water so clear it created an optical illusion of shallowness despite Rowan's assurance that the main pool was over 20 feet deep. Under different circumstances, I would have been captivated, eager to photograph such pristine natural beauty. But something felt wrong about the place. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, rustling leaves, had fallen silent, creating an unnatural void of sound except for the gentle gurgle of flowing water. And there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on until Vanessa voiced it. "There are no animals," she said quietly. "No tracks, no droppings, nothing. Everything avoids this place." Rowan laughed too loudly in response, his voice echoing strangely against the surrounding rocks. "That's ridiculous. Look, fish." He pointed to shadowy movements beneath the crystal water. I squinted, following his gesture, and felt my blood turn to ice. What moved beneath the surface didn't have the sleek, darting motion of fish. The shapes were too large, too deliberate in their movements, too coordinated. Rowan was the first to enter the water, stripping down to his swim shorts with an enthusiasm that seemed increasingly forced. "Come on in. The water's perfect," he called, wading out to chest depth. Vanessa and I remained on shore, exchanging uneasy glances. The shadowy shapes I'd noticed earlier had vanished as soon as Rowan disturbed the surface, but their absence did nothing to ease my growing sense of dread. "Rowan, maybe we should," I began, but my words died in my throat as I noticed something peculiar. Where the water met Rowan's skin, a faint discoloration was spreading, a barely perceptible reddening, as if the crystal-clear water were somehow irritating his flesh. He hadn't seemed to notice yet, still splashing and calling for us to join him. "Get out!" Vanessa suddenly screamed, her voice cracking with genuine terror. "Rowan, get out of the water now." Her urgency must have penetrated even his stubborn cheerfulness, because he turned toward us with confusion written across his face. That's when I saw it, a dark shape materializing in the water behind him, causing barely a ripple as it rose to the surface. From my angle, I could make out only a vague silhouette, something elongated and sleek, but definitely not a fish or alligator or any creature I could readily identify. Rowan, oblivious, was still frowning at us from the center of the pool. "What's wrong with you two?" "It's just..." The rest of his sentence transformed into a shocked gasp as something yanked him abruptly downward, submerging him to his neck. What happened next unfolded with horrifying speed. Rowan thrashed wildly, his face contorted in a silent scream as he struggled against whatever had hold of him. The water around him churned and frothed, turning from crystal clear to a cloudy red with alarming rapidity. Vanessa sprinted toward the water's edge, the knife she'd pocketed earlier now clutched in her white-knuckled grip. I unfroze a moment later, racing after her while frantically scanning the shore for anything that might serve as a weapon. By the time we reached the water, Rowan had managed to break free and was crawling toward us, his lower body still submerged. The expression on his face, a combination of agony, disbelief, and primal fear, will haunt me for the rest of my days. "Help me!" he gasped as we grabbed his arms and hauled him onto the rocky shore. His swim shorts were in tatters, and his legs, dear God, his legs. The skin was shredded in long, parallel strips, exposing muscle and bone beneath. Whatever had attacked him possessed claws or teeth designed for efficient flaying. Blood poured from the wounds, forming scarlet rivulets that flowed back into the now murky water. Vanessa tore off her shirt, using it as a makeshift tourniquet while I fumbled with trembling hands for the first aid kit in my backpack. Rowan's eyes were wide with shock, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. "Didn't see it," he kept repeating. "Didn't see it coming. Felt like hands, so many hands." The springs, so serene just moments before, had transformed into a scene from a nightmare. The water's surface, previously mirror-smooth, now rippled with constant movement, as if something, or many somethings, were circling just beneath. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of pale shapes rising almost to the surface before sinking back into the depths, shapes that resembled human limbs but were too elongated, too fluid in their movements. The most disturbing part was the absolute silence of it all. Whatever lurked in those waters made no sound, no splashing, no breathing, nothing to betray its presence except the visual disturbance of the water itself. Vanessa worked on Rowan's wounds with grim efficiency, her earlier fear transformed into focused determination. "We need to get him back to the campsite," she muttered, not looking up from her task. "Back to the car. He needs a hospital." The gravity of our situation hit me like a physical blow. We were miles from our campsite, with no cell service, and Rowan clearly couldn't walk. We'd have to carry him through dense forest, following a trail that even Rowan had struggled to navigate when he was uninjured. And all the while, we'd be vulnerable to whatever had attacked him, whatever might even now be emerging from the water to follow us on land. As if reading my thoughts, Vanessa's eyes darted to the water's edge, where the crystal liquid now lapped against the shore with unnatural rhythm, almost like breathing. "They won't follow us far from the water," she said quietly. "At least, that's what the stories say." This was the first confirmation that she knew more than she'd been telling us. "What stories, Vanessa?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady as I helped her bandage the worst of Rowan's wounds. "What the hell is in that water? And why did you let us come here if you knew it was dangerous?" Her eyes met mine, filled with a complex mixture of guilt and defiance. "I tried to warn you both," she whispered. This morning I tried, but Rowan wouldn't listen. He never listens. Rowan had fallen unconscious, his face ashen from blood loss despite our best efforts to stanch the flow. Between us, Vanessa and I managed to fashion a crude stretcher using my jacket and some fallen branches. As we prepared to lift him, an unearthly sound echoed across the water. A high, keening wail that started as something resembling a bird call, but modulated into what could only be described as speech, though in no language I'd ever heard. Vanessa froze, her face draining of color. We need to go, she hissed. Now? They're calling the others. Without waiting for my response, she grabbed one end of the makeshift stretcher. I took the other, and together we began our desperate journey back through the forest, the inhuman wailing growing louder behind us with each step we took. The return journey quickly became a waking nightmare. The trail, difficult to follow on our way to the springs, seemed to have vanished entirely. Every tree, every rock, every patch of undergrowth looked identical, creating a disorienting maze that had us walking in circles despite our best efforts to maintain a straight path. The forest itself seemed to be conspiring against us, roots rising up to trip our feet, branches whipping at our faces, thorny vines appearing where none had been before. All the while, Rowan's condition deteriorated. The makeshift bandages were soaked through with blood, and his breathing had become shallow and irregular. Occasionally he would regain consciousness, muttering incoherently about hands reaching up and faces in the water, before lapsing back into merciful unawareness. The first real sign that we were being pursued came about an hour into our desperate flight. We had stopped briefly to adjust our grip on the stretcher and check Rowan's bandages when Vanessa suddenly went rigid, her head snapping up like a startled deer. Listen, she whispered, though I heard nothing beyond our own labored breathing and the ambient sounds of the forest. Then, gradually, I became aware of it, a peculiar quality to the rustling of leaves behind us, a rhythm too regular to be caused by wind or animals. Something was moving through the underbrush, matching its pace to ours, stopping when we stopped. And it wasn't alone. Similar sounds now came from our left, then our right, a coordinated effort to surround us. They never come this far from the water, Vanessa hissed, fear making her voice tremble for the first time since the attack. Never. The old stories say they're bound to it. I didn't waste breath asking who they were or what old stories she meant. The immediate threat was clear enough. We need to move faster, I urged, hoisting my end of the stretcher higher. Find a trail. Get back to camp. Easier said than done. The forest had become increasingly dense, the ground treacherously uneven. Each step required careful consideration, yet speed was essential. The weight of Rowan between us grew heavier with every passing minute, and the knowledge that unseen entities were closing in from all sides made the air itself feel thick and oppressive. A fallen tree blocked our path, too massive to easily circumvent with the stretcher. As we hesitated, contemplating our options, a sound cut through the forest ambience. A sound so human, yet simultaneously wrong that the hair on my neck stood on end. It was laughter, but distorted, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. It came from directly ahead of us, beyond the fallen tree. Another burst of laughter answered from behind, then another from our left. They were toying with us. Vanessa set down her end of the stretcher, her face a mask of grim determination as she pulled out her pocket knife. This won't stop them, she said quietly, but it might slow them down. I carefully propped Rowan against the fallen trunk and looked around desperately for anything that might serve as a weapon. My gaze fell on a heavy branch, partially rotted but still solid enough to deliver a decent blow. I wrenched it free from the undergrowth just as the first of our pursuers stepped into view. I've struggled for months to adequately describe what emerged from between the trees that day. Human-shaped, yes, but only in the most basic anatomical sense. Bipedal, with appendages that approximated arms and legs, and a head-like bulge atop the torso. But everything was wrong. Proportions stretched and distorted like a reflection in a funhouse mirror, skin the pale blue-white of something that lives without sunlight, and movements that seemed to flow rather than stride, as if bones were optional rather than necessary. Its face, God help me, its face held just enough human features to make the wrongness of it cut straight through to some primal part of my brain. Eyes too large and round, set too far apart. a mouth that stretched nearly ear to ear, filled with needle-thin teeth. And the worst part? I recognized it. Beneath the distortions and the pallid, waxy skin, I could still make out the features of the missing hiker from the bulletin board, the young woman named Lena who had disappeared 3 weeks earlier. The creature, Lena, or what had once been Lena, tilted its head at an impossible angle, studying us with unblinking eyes that reflected light like a cat's. Its mouth stretched wider, revealing row upon row of those needle teeth, and from its throat came that same distorted laughter we'd heard moments before. Behind it, more shapes were emerging from the tree-line, all humanoid, all wrong in the same fundamental ways, some recognizable as former people, others transformed beyond any hope of identification. They moved with unnatural coordination, spreading out to cut off any possible escape route. Vanessa stepped backward until she bumped against me, her knife held out before her in a trembling hand. "The water changed them," she whispered. "It's been happening for generations. People go missing, then come back, different." What happened next unfolded with dreamlike slowness, each moment stretching into eternity. The creature that had been Lena took a step toward us, leaving a wet footprint on the forest floor, the same oddly shaped print I'd seen outside my tent the previous night. Rowan chose that moment to regain consciousness, a low moan escaping his lips as he stirred against the fallen tree. The sound attracted Lena's attention, her head swiveling with fluid grace to focus on him. Something like recognition flickered in those inhuman eyes, and her distorted face contorted into what might have been an expression of hunger or longing. She moved toward him with sudden speed, covering the distance between us in a single flowing motion. Vanessa lunged forward with her knife, but the blade passed through Lena's pale flesh as if through water, leaving no wound, no blood, just a momentary disruption in form that sealed itself instantly. In that moment of shock paralysis, the other creatures surged forward. I swung my branch wildly, feeling it connect solidly with something that gave way too easily, like striking dense jelly. Cold, damp hands clutched at my clothing, my skin, my hair, dozens of them from all directions. They pulled and prodded with unnerving gentleness, not trying to injure, but to capture. Through the press of pale bodies, I caught glimpses of Vanessa similarly ensnared, fighting with desperate intensity as they dragged her steadily away from me, toward the direction of the springs. Rowan had disappeared entirely beneath a writhing mass of the creatures, his screams cutting through the cacophony of that terrible laughter. My salvation came in the form of pure accident. As I was pulled backward, my foot caught on an exposed root, sending me crashing to the ground with such force that the creatures momentarily lost their grip. In that split second of freedom, pure instinct took over. I rolled beneath the fallen tree we'd been trying to circumvent, scraping skin from my back and shoulders in the process, but putting a solid barrier between myself and most of my attackers. On the other side, I scrambled to my feet and ran, abandoning the makeshift weapons, abandoning any thought of rescuing Vanessa or Rowan, driven by nothing but the primal urge to survive. Behind me, Vanessa's screams rose to a pitch of pure terror before cutting off with horrifying abruptness. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the screaming had been. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to buckle beneath me, crashing through underbrush, stumbling over roots, oblivious to the scratches and cuts that covered my exposed skin. The pursuing laughter grew fainter with distance, but I didn't slow down, couldn't slow down, until the forest suddenly opened up before me and I found myself on the shore of the lake where we had camped. The sight of our tents, still standing undisturbed in the late afternoon sunlight, hit me with a wave of surreal dissonance. Had it been only this morning that we'd left this place? It felt like years had passed, like I had aged a decade in those few horrific hours. My car sat where we had left it, keys still in the ignition, because who would steal a car out here in the middle of nowhere? I threw myself into the driver's seat, my blood-slick hands fumbling with the keys before the engine roared to life. Only then did I allow myself to look back toward the forest. They stood at the tree-line, a dozen or more of the pale figures, watching me with those reflective eyes. They made no move to approach the vehicle, confirming Vanessa's assertion that they wouldn't stray far from water. The creature that had been Lena stepped slightly ahead of the others, her distorted face tilted in that unnatural angle of curiosity. In her elongated hand, she held something that took my brain several seconds to identify. Vanessa's torn and bloodied shirt, the one she had used to bandage Rowan's wounds. I drove like a man possessed, my car bouncing violently over the unpaved forest road as branches whipped against the windows. Each curve, each bump jolted me with the terrifying possibility that I'd taken a wrong turn, that I was heading deeper into the nightmare rather than away from it. The GPS was useless without signal, and in my panic, I'd paid little attention to landmarks on our inbound journey. Only when the road widened and smoothed did I allow myself to believe I might actually escape. The first highway sign pointing toward Orlando nearly made me weep with relief. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the forest, watching the fuel gauge drop with mounting anxiety. The small general store where we'd stopped for supplies the previous day appeared like a mirage on the horizon, its faded sign a beacon of civilization. I pulled into the dusty parking lot and sat trembling behind the wheel for a full 5 minutes, unable to make myself exit the vehicle. What would I tell them? Who would believe what had happened at the Springs? As I sat frozen in indecision, an elderly man emerged from the store, the same cashier who had chatted with Rowan yesterday about fishing conditions. He spotted me and raised a hand in friendly greeting, then paused, his expression changing as he took in my disheveled state through the windshield. That simple human interaction broke my paralysis. I stumbled from the car, nearly collapsing as my trembling legs struggled to support me. "My friends," I babbled as the old man helped me inside. "They're still out there. Something took them. Something in the water." To his credit, he asked no questions, simply sat me down and placed a bottle of water in my shaking hands while he made a phone call. I gulped the water greedily, only then realizing how desperately dehydrated I was. As I drank, my gaze drifted to the bulletin board with its missing person flyers. There were more than I remembered from yesterday, or perhaps I simply hadn't noticed them all. Dozens of faces stared back at me, people of all ages who had ventured into those woods over the years and never returned. And with a cold shock of recognition, I realized I knew what had happened to each and every one of them. The local sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, a weathered woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened to my stumbling account with an impassivity that might have seemed callous if not for the way her hand occasionally strayed to the cross hanging around her neck. When I finished, the silence stretched between us until I was certain she thought me insane or worse. Then she sighed deeply and exchanged a knowing look with the store owner. "Third one this year," she said quietly. "And we're not even into tourist season yet." The casual acceptance in her voice struck me harder than any disbelief would have. They knew. They had always known what lurked in those waters. "We'll send out a search party," the sheriff assured me, though her tone conveyed the futility of the gesture. "But I need to be straight with you. We won't find your friends. Not alive, anyway." She hesitated, then added more gently, "And if we do find them, they won't be the same. Best thing you can do now is try to forget what you saw out there. Go back to Chicago, Mr. Fletcher. This isn't your fight." I wanted to scream at her, to demand action, to insist that Rowan and Vanessa might still be saved. But the absolute certainty in her eyes stopped me. This woman had seen it all before. Many times. The official report listed Rowan and Vanessa as missing, presumed drowned in a tragic swimming accident. Their families were notified, search parties went through the motions for the requisite number of days, and eventually life moved on for everyone except those closest to them. I gave my statement, carefully editing out the impossible elements that no one would believe, focusing instead on the attack in the water that I attributed to an alligator. The sheriff nodded approvingly as I spoke, and I understood the unspoken agreement between us. Some truths are better left unuttered, some horrors better left undocumented. I returned to Chicago a changed man. My apartment, once a sanctuary of urban comfort, now feels like a temporary shelter against dangers I never knew existed. I've thrown myself into research, spending countless hours in libraries and online archives, searching for any information about the springs and the creatures that inhabit them. There isn't much, a few obscure legends from the Seminole and Timucua peoples, vague references in Spanish colonial records to water demons that steal human forms, and scattered accounts from settlers who ventured too deep into the forest and encountered things they couldn't explain. But piecing it all together, a pattern emerges, a cycle of disappearances stretching back centuries, all centered around those crystal springs. The nightmares come almost nightly. Vivid reruns of that terrible day intercut with new horrors my mind concocts to fill the gaps in my knowledge. In the worst of these dreams, I see Rowan and Vanessa as they must be now, transformed by the water into pale, distorted versions of themselves, hunting new victims in the depths of the Ocala forest. Sometimes I awake screaming, convinced that wet footprints lead from my bedroom door to the foot of my bed, that the sound of distorted laughter echoes from my bathroom drain. My therapist calls it PTSD. She's not wrong, but she doesn't understand the true source of my terror. The knowledge that these creatures exist, that they continue to take people, and that no one is doing anything to stop them. Last week, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was Rowan's waterproof camera, the one he had brought to document our camping trip. The outer casing was scratched and dented, but the memory card was intact. With trembling fingers, I inserted it into my computer. Most of the photos were what you'd expect: landscapes, wildlife, selfies of Rowan and Vanessa at various Orlando attractions before I arrived. But the final image turned my blood to ice. It showed me, asleep in my tent that first night, taken from just outside the thin fabric wall. The angle was impossible, too high to have been taken by anyone standing on the ground, as if the photographer had been floating several feet in the air. And reflected in the camera lens, barely visible but unmistakable once noticed, was a face, a distorted, elongated face with two large eyes that gleamed in the darkness. Lena's face, watching me sleep, hours before we ever reached the springs where Rowan was attacked. I haven't slept properly since viewing that photo. I've booked myself into a hotel, unable to face my apartment with its drains and pipes that connect, however distantly, to other bodies of water. I find myself avoiding puddles, refusing to swim, even limiting how long I spend in the shower. Water no longer feels safe. And always, in the back of my mind, there's a growing certainty that it isn't over, that the creatures from the springs aren't content to wait for new victims to wander into their territory. The image on that camera proves they can travel, at least for short periods, far from their watery home. How far, I wonder? Could they follow a particular scent, a specific person, all the way from Florida to Illinois? Sometimes, late at night when the city outside my window falls quiet, I catch myself listening for that distinctive, distorted laughter. And sometimes, this is the thought that truly terrifies me. I think I hear it, rising faintly from the bathroom sink or bubbling up from the toilet bowl. I tell myself it's just the normal sounds of plumbing in an old building, but part of me knows better. They found me once, in my tent in those dark woods. I have no doubt they can find me again. And when the tap water in my hotel bathroom ran blue-white for just a moment this morning before clearing, I knew with cold certainty that my time is running out. Thaddeus Wayne Fletcher might soon be just another missing person flyer on a bulletin board, another face transformed beyond recognition, another hunter in the crystal waters. If you're reading this, stay away from Orlando's wilderness areas. Stay away from crystal clear springs that are too perfect, too inviting. And if you ever find yourself camping near still water and hear laughter that sounds almost human but not quite right, run. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Just run. It won't save you. Not really, not forever. But it might buy you time. A little more precious time, before the water claims you too. I should have trusted my gut when that park ranger gave us that strange look. Now Melissa's gone, and I'm pretty sure I won't make it to see another sunrise. That thought keeps racing through my mind as I hide behind this rotting log, listening to something large moving through the underbrush nearby. My name is Deacon Mitchell Reed, 34 years old, born and raised in Pittsburgh. I never thought a simple camping trip would end like this. It started 3 weeks ago when my buddy Talbert suggested we take a break from the Pennsylvania winter and head down to Florida. Man, we need some sunshine before we lose our minds, he'd said, showing me pictures of Wekiwa Springs State Park just north of Orlando. The crystal clear waters and lush greenery looked like paradise compared to the gray slush outside my apartment window. I'd just gone through a nasty breakup with Caroline, and the idea of escaping somewhere warm and forgetting about life for a while seemed perfect. We convinced Melissa, Talbert's cousin from Miami, to join us. She knew Florida well, having grown up there, and promised to show us some real Florida beyond the tourist traps. Within days, I'd packed up my Honda CR-V with camping gear, swimsuits, and enough beer to forget about Caroline completely. The vehicle was practically new, and I was eager to test it out on a proper road trip. Something about hitting the open highway feels like freedom, like you're leaving all your problems behind. The drive down I-95 was uneventful, just mile after mile of highway, fast food stops, and the three of us taking turns at the wheel. Talbert kept us entertained with his wild stories and conspiracy theories, while Melissa rolled her eyes and corrected his most outlandish claims. I mostly stayed quiet, watching the landscape gradually change from winter bare trees to pine forests and eventually palm trees. The further south we drove, the lighter I felt. By the time we crossed into Florida, I was actually smiling again. We arrived in Orlando late afternoon, the sky turning that perfect Florida gold as the sun began to set. Rather than heading straight to the campground, Melissa suggested we stop at a local dive bar she knew from college, a place called The Swamp on the outskirts of the city. "Trust me," she said with a wink. "This place has the best gator bites in Central Florida, and you haven't lived until you've tried their moonshine cocktails." The unassuming cinder block building didn't look like much from the outside, but inside, it was packed with locals and a few tourists brave enough to venture away from the theme parks. The bar was dimly lit, with alligator heads mounted on the walls and fishing nets hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled of fried food, spilled beer, and cigarettes, despite Florida's indoor smoking ban. We squeezed into a booth in the corner, and Melissa ordered a round of drinks from a heavily tattooed bartender named Cruz. As we clinked glasses, I felt the last of my Pittsburgh stress melting away. That's when I first noticed the old man watching us from the bar, his weathered face partially hidden beneath a worn fishing cap. "You folks heading out to Waikiki?" he asked, his voice like gravel. When we nodded, he gave a strange little laugh. "Pretty time of year to go, I suppose. Just stay on the marked trails, you hear? Especially around dusk. The springs are beautiful, but the woods out there, well, they've got a history." Before we could ask what he meant, Cruz called him away, and the old-timer shuffled back to his bar stool, leaving us with nothing but his cryptic warning and a growing sense of unease. We stayed at the Swamp until well past midnight, drinking and laughing as Melissa introduced us to locals with names like Gator Pete and Sunshine Sally. By the time we left, I was pleasantly drunk and had forgotten all about the old man's warning. We decided to spend the night at a motel and head to the campground in the morning. As I drifted off to sleep in the musty motel room, I had no idea that our fun road trip was about to turn into the most disturbing and terrifying experience of my life. Morning came with a vengeful hangover and the kind of Florida humidity that makes you feel like you're breathing through a wet towel. Talbert was still snoring when I dragged myself to the motel's office for their complimentary coffee, which tasted like it had been brewed in a sock. Melissa was already outside, talking on her phone, looking uncharacteristically concerned. When she hung up, she hesitated before joining me. "Everything okay?" I asked, squinting against the painfully bright sunlight. "Yeah, just weird. My friend who works at Waikiki says they've had some issues lately. A couple hikers went missing last month, and there have been reports of strange noises at night." She shrugged, trying to look casual. "Probably just gators or wild boars. Florida stuff, you know? But maybe we should camp somewhere else." I thought about it for a second, but the idea of changing plans seemed like a hassle, especially with our throbbing heads. "Nah, we'll be fine. We're experienced campers, and we've got that fancy bear spray I bought for that Yellowstone trip. Works on gators too, probably." I forced a laugh that didn't quite hide my unease. Besides, how often do you hear about tourists actually having problems? It's always the locals who stir up the spooky stories. By the time we'd packed up and hit the road, the sun was high in the sky, burning away both the morning dew and our lingering doubts. We stopped at a grocery store for supplies: water, hot dogs, marshmallows, and more beer, the standard camping fare. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with frizzy blonde hair and a name tag that read Bethany, made small talk as she scanned our items. "Y'all staying local or just passing through?" When we mentioned Waikiki Springs, her friendly smile faltered for just a second. "Oh, it's real pretty out there. Don't forget your bug spray though. The mosquitoes been terrible since all that rain last week." She paused, then added, "And they close the gates at sunset these days. New policy." Something about the way she said it made me feel like there was more to the story, but she quickly changed the subject to the weather. We reached Wakiwa Springs State Park just after noon. The ranger at the entrance booth was a thin man named Thaddeus with deep-set eyes and a permanent squint. He took our camping fee and handed over a map, his fingers lingering on the paper as he circled our designated site. "You folks planning to swim in the springs?" When we nodded eagerly, the crystal blue water was the main attraction. After all, he frowned slightly. "Water's been a bit murky lately, and we asked that everyone's out of the water at least an hour before sunset. No exceptions." Talbert immediately launched into 20 questions about why, but the ranger just kept repeating "park policy" in an increasingly irritated tone. Eventually, he waved us through, but not before giving our vehicle a long, evaluating look, as if committing it to memory. "That's strike two on the creepy local warnings," Talbert joked as we drove away. "One more, and we're legally obligated to get the hell out of here according to horror movie rules." Our campsite was beautiful, a secluded spot surrounded by palms and cypress trees, with Spanish moss hanging like ghostly curtains. The air smelled of pine and something vaguely sweet, like flowers or fruit. We set up our tents, and I was just starting to relax when I noticed something odd. There were no other campers nearby. For a popular state park on a perfect weather weekend, it seemed strangely deserted. "Guys," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "is it weird that we're the only ones here?" Melissa shrugged. "It's off-season. Most tourists are at Disney or Universal this time of year. But there's usually at least a few other nature lovers around," Talbert said, looking up from hammering a tent stake. "And some of the sites we passed looked recently used, but also abandoned, like people left in a hurry." I was about to suggest we drive around to check the other camping areas when I heard it, a weird, warbling cry from somewhere in the woods. Not quite a bird, not quite. Well, anything I'd ever heard before. It rose and fell in pitch, almost like someone trying to mimic a loon, but getting it horribly wrong. We all froze, exchanging glances. "What the actual hell was that?" Talbert whispered. "Could be anything," Melissa said, but her usually confident voice wavered. "Florida's full of weird wildlife. Probably just a bird you guys don't have up north." I wanted to believe her, but something about that sound raised the hair on the back of my neck. It didn't sound natural. It sounded almost deliberate, like a signal, or a warning. And as we stood there in tense silence, I could have sworn I heard, very faintly, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, circling our campsite just beyond the tree line. "Let's go check out those springs," Talbert suggested, a little too loudly, clearly trying to break the strange tension that had settled over us. We grabbed our swimming gear and hiked the short trail to the main spring. The sight that greeted us was genuinely breathtaking. A natural pool of water so clear you could see every detail of the limestone bottom, surrounded by lush vegetation. On any other day, I would have been enchanted, but today, something felt off. The ranger hadn't been lying about the water being murky in spots. There were patches of cloudy water, almost milky in appearance, floating near one edge of the spring. Even stranger, there were only a handful of other visitors, an elderly couple reading on a bench, and a family with two small children getting ready to leave. The usual jubilant atmosphere of a popular swimming hole was noticeably absent, replaced by an eerie quietness broken only by the occasional splash or bird call. "Is it just me, or does that water look weird?" I asked, pointing to the cloudy patches, like someone dumped paint or something in it. "It's probably just sediment stirred up from the bottom," Melissa said, but she didn't sound convinced. She dipped her hand in the water and brought it to her nose. "Smells normal enough, but it feels different somehow. Slicker." Despite our misgivings, the Florida heat eventually won out. We changed into our swimsuits and waded in. The water was refreshingly cool, and for a while, we forgot our concerns, splashing around like kids. Talbert attempted to do a backflip off a low-hanging cypress branch and belly flopped spectacularly, making us howl with laughter. It was just what we needed, a reminder that we were here to have fun, not scare ourselves with imaginary threats. Around 4 p.m., the elderly couple packed up and left. Shortly after, the family followed. By 5 p.m., we were completely alone at the spring. The sun was starting to lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the water. That's when Melissa noticed the cuts on her legs. What the hell? She stood in waist-deep water, examining several small, perfectly straight incisions on her calves and thighs. They weren't deep, but they were definitely fresh, oozing tiny beads of blood. These weren't here before. Talbert and I checked ourselves and found similar cuts, small, precise, almost surgical-looking marks that didn't hurt, but definitely hadn't been there when we entered the water. Maybe it's some kind of water plant with sharp edges? I suggested, though I couldn't see anything in the crystal-clear water that could have caused such injuries. I think we should go, Melissa said firmly, already wading toward shore. The ranger said to be out of the water before sunset anyway. As we toweled off, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Small, finger-like impressions on Melissa's ankle, as if something with tiny hands had grabbed her underwater. When I pointed them out, she went pale. That's not possible. I would have felt that. Let's just get back to camp, Talbert said, his usual joking manner completely gone. I don't like this at all. The walk back to our campsite seemed longer somehow, the woods around us fuller with shadows. That strange cry we'd heard earlier came again, closer this time, followed by another answering from a different direction. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in beautiful oranges and pinks that would have been spectacular under different circumstances. But as darkness began to creep between the trees, none of us could appreciate the view. Back at camp, we built a fire much larger than necessary, none of us wanting to admit we were trying to keep something at bay. Conversation was stilted as we roasted hot dogs and pretended everything was normal. Night fell completely, bringing with it a chorus of cicadas, frogs, and other normal nighttime sounds. But underneath them, just at the edge of hearing, was something else, a soft, rhythmic sound almost like breathing, but too regular, too mechanical. Do you guys hear that? I whispered, not wanting to speak too loudly. Melissa nodded, her eyes wide in the firelight. It sounds like, I don't know, like something's watching us. That's ridiculous, Talbert said, but he was clutching his beer can so tightly it was starting to crumple. It's just normal forest sounds. But we all knew it wasn't. And when the flashlight beam I casually aimed at the tree line caught a pair of reflecting eyes, not low to the ground like an animal's, but at human height, we couldn't deny it anymore. Something was out there. Something was watching us. And as the eyes blinked and disappeared, I had the horrible certainty that whatever it wasn't alone. The night grew increasingly terrifying as we huddled around our campfire, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. Around midnight, Talbert suggested we take shifts keeping watch while the others tried to sleep. I volunteered for the first shift, though I doubted any of us would actually manage to close our eyes. Melissa and Talbert retreated to their tents, leaving me alone with the fire and my racing thoughts. For the first hour, nothing happened. The strange breathing sound had stopped, and even the normal forest noises seemed muted, as if the wildlife was hiding too. I was just starting to think we'd let our imaginations run wild when I heard it. A soft, deliberate scraping noise coming from the direction of my Honda. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached, the beam shaking in my unsteady hand. What I saw turned my blood to ice. Someone, or something, had used a sharp object to carve a symbol into the hood of my car. It looked like a crude stick figure surrounded by radiating lines, almost like a child's drawing of the sun, except there was nothing childlike about the precision of the cuts or the strange, dark substance filling the grooves that looked disturbingly like dried blood. I backed away slowly, then ran to wake the others. "We need to leave," I hissed, shaking Talbert awake. "Now?" Someone's been at the car. We packed in record time, throwing our gear haphazardly into the Honda. The symbol on the hood seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, which I told myself was just a trick of the flashlight. As Melissa was rolling up her sleeping bag, she suddenly froze, staring into the woods. "There's someone out there," she whispered. "I can see them moving between the trees." I followed her gaze and caught glimpses of what looked like pale, elongated figures slipping from tree to tree, moving in a bizarre, jerky fashion that no human could mimic. They were closing in on us from all sides, maintaining just enough distance to stay in the shadows. Talbert let out a string of curses as he hurried to douse the fire. "We're leaving everything else," I decided, throwing the last essential items into the car. "Get in. Now." The engine roared to life, and I flipped on the high beams, illuminating the scene before us. What I saw in that moment will haunt me forever. Pale, emaciated humanoid figures with unnaturally long limbs and smooth, featureless faces retreating from the light, but not fleeing. They were positioning themselves on the access road. I realized with horror. They were trying to cut off our escape. I slammed the Honda into reverse, then shifted into drive and floored it, heading straight for the narrowest part of their loose formation. Melissa screamed as one of the creatures lunged at her window, spindly fingers splaying against the glass, leaving behind smears of that same dark substance I'd seen on my car. I swerved, nearly hitting a tree, then straightened out and accelerated down the dark park road. What the fuck were those things? Talbert was hyperventilating in the back seat. Did you see their faces? They didn't have faces. Just keep driving, Melissa urged, constantly checking the side mirror. They're following us. I can see them moving through the trees. I pushed the Honda to its limits, taking the curves of the park road way too fast, desperate to reach the main gate. When we finally saw it looming ahead, relief washed over me, until I realized it was closed and locked, a heavy chain securing the metal gates. No, no, no. I pounded the steering wheel. The ranger said they close at sunset, but I thought there'd be a way out. There. Melissa pointed to a small maintenance road branching off to the right. Maybe that leads to another exit. With the creatures getting closer, I could now see their distorted silhouettes illuminated by my taillights. I had no choice. I turned onto the narrow dirt track, branches scraping against the sides of the Honda as we bounced and jolted our way forward. The track grew progressively worse, mud sucking at our tires, threatening to strand us in the middle of nowhere. I think we're heading deeper into the park, Talbert said, his voice trembling. This doesn't go out. We need to turn around. But turning around meant facing those things again. I was about to argue when the Honda's front tire hit something solid, and we lurched to a stop. In the headlights, I could see we'd reached some kind of concrete structure, an old building, half reclaimed by the forest. And carved into its stone facade was that same sun-like symbol from my car hood, but much larger and more elaborate. We have to make a run for it, I said, reaching for the door handle. The car's stuck. We'll hide inside until morning. Are you insane? Melissa grabbed my arm. We can't go in there. Before I could respond, something heavy landed on the roof of the car with a dull thud. Slowly, a face lowered into view through the windshield, upside down, pale as moonlight, with just smooth skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should be. Yet somehow, I knew it was looking right at us. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that we had been herded here deliberately. This wasn't an escape at all. It was a trap. The thing on our hood made a sound, that same warbling cry we'd heard earlier, but up close, it was unmistakably a form of communication. Immediately, the woods around us came alive with movement as more of the creatures emerged from the trees surrounding the Honda. There had to be at least 20 of them, all with those same featureless faces and elongated limbs, moving with that unnatural, jerky gait. The building, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's our only chance. When I say go, we all run for the door. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. Talbert was shaking so badly I wasn't sure he could run, but he nodded. Melissa gripped my hand, her fingers ice cold. I counted down from 3, then shouted go, and we burst from the car, sprinting toward the concrete structure. I made it to the door first, yanking on the rusted handle. It gave way with a screech of metal, revealing a dark interior. Melissa was right behind me, diving through the opening. But Talbert wasn't so lucky. Halfway to the door, he tripped on an exposed root and went down hard. Before he could get up, the creatures were on him. His screams cut through the night as they dragged him into the woods, his fingers leaving desperate furrows in the soft earth. Melissa tried to go after him, but I held her back, pulling her inside the building and slamming the door shut. Her sobs echoed off the concrete walls as I fumbled with my flashlight, finally illuminating our surroundings. We were in some kind of old pump house or water treatment facility, long abandoned. Rusty pipes lined the walls, and the floor was covered in years of debris, leaves, animal droppings, and what looked like the remains of previous campfires. We weren't the first to seek refuge here. We have to help him, Melissa pleaded, tears streaming down her face. We can't just leave him out there with those things. It's too late, I said, the words tasting bitter. You saw how many there were. We just end up like him. The guilt was crushing, but the will to survive was stronger. We need to barricade this door and figure out a plan. We worked silently, dragging broken equipment and debris to block the entrance. Outside, Talbert's screams had stopped, replaced by those eerie warbling calls, now seemingly celebratory in nature. I tried not to imagine what they were doing to him. As we worked, my flashlight beam caught something on the far wall. More of those sun-like symbols, dozens of them, painted or carved into every surface, along with strange, flowing script I'd never seen before. What is this place? Melissa whispered, tracing one of the symbols with her finger. These look ancient, but this building can't be more than 50 years old. Before I could respond, a metallic clang echoed from deeper in the building. We weren't alone. Grabbing a rusted pipe for a weapon, I led the way into the darkness, Melissa close behind me. The pump house was larger than it appeared from outside, with corridors branching off in several directions. The clanging sound came again, drawing us toward what looked like an old control room. Inside, hunched over an ancient control panel, was a figure. Not one of the creatures, but a man, rail-thin, with wild gray hair and clothes that hung in tatters. When he turned to face us, I recognized him immediately, the old man from the swamp bar, the one who'd warned us about Wakua. Figured you'd end up here, he said, his voice eerily calm. They always bring the offerings to the old pump house. Offerings? Melissa's voice cracked. What are you talking about? What happened to Talbert? The old man's laugh was hollow, empty of any humor. Your friend is feeding them now, just like the others, just like you will. He gestured to the symbols on the walls. The Seminole knew about them, called them the Faceless Ones, said they lived in the underwater caves beneath the springs, coming out only when they needed to feed. He explained, with the detached precision of a madman, how the creatures had been dormant for decades until recent construction work had disturbed their underwater home. How they'd started taking people, hikers, campers, anyone they could isolate, and how the local authorities covered it up to protect the tourism industry. How he'd tried to warn people, but eventually realized it was futile. They need to feed every few weeks, he continued, fiddling with dials on the control panel. If they don't get outsiders, they take locals. So we made an arrangement. We send them tourists, they leave us alone. His eyes, when they met mine, were completely devoid of remorse. Nothing personal, just survival. With horrifying clarity, I understood. The park ranger, the bartender, the grocery store clerk, they'd all been in on it. The strange warnings, the closed gates, even the cuts from the spring, all designed to mark us, to hurt us exactly where they wanted us. And now we were trapped. You're insane, I spat, raising my makeshift weapon. You're helping them kill innocent people. The old man shrugged. Been doing it for years now, and you're not leaving here alive to tell anyone. What happened next was chaos. The old man lunged for Melissa, but I swung the pipe, connecting with his shoulder. He howled in pain, stumbling backward into the control panel. Sparks flew as ancient circuits shorted out, and somewhere deep in the building, machinery groaned to life for the first time in decades. Water began to gush from rusted pipes, quickly flooding the floor. You fools, the old man screamed. You've activated the pumps. They'll think it's an attack on their home. As if in response, those warbling cries rose in volume and intensity outside, taking on an angry, frenzied quality. The building shook as something, many somethings, began to pound on the walls and roof, looking for a way in. We need to get out of here. I grabbed Melissa's hand, pulling her toward the door. Now, there's a maintenance tunnel, the old man said, suddenly cooperative in the face of a threat even he feared. It leads to the main road. We might make it if... He never finished the sentence. The ceiling above him gave way, and pale, elongated arms reached down, yanking him upward with impossible strength. His screams joined the cacophony as Melissa and I ran, water now up to our ankles, frantically searching for the tunnel he'd mentioned. We found it behind a rusted door, a narrow concrete passage barely big enough to crawl through. Without hesitation, we dropped to our hands and knees and started moving, the sounds of destruction growing more distant behind us. The tunnel seemed endless, pitch black except for the fading beam of my flashlight, the air thick with the smell of mold and stagnant water. After what felt like hours, we saw light ahead, the exit. We emerged into pre-dawn grayness, in a drainage ditch alongside a deserted highway. Exhausted, covered in mud and blood, we collapsed on the roadside, waiting for the first signs of traffic. As the sun rose, painting the sky in the same beautiful colors we'd admired just yesterday, Melissa finally broke our silence. They'll come for us, won't they? They know what we've seen. I nodded slowly. We can't go to the police. If the whole town's in on it. So what do? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't stay in Orlando, couldn't risk returning to any place where the old man might have connections. We'd have to keep moving, keep running, always looking over our shoulders for pale, faceless figures in the shadows. And I knew, with cold certainty, that every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear Talbert's screams and see those blank, featureless faces staring back at me. As I sit here now, hiding behind this rotting log, I can hear them moving closer. Melissa ran in the opposite direction, trying to draw them away, but I don't think she made it. The batteries in my flashlight are almost dead, and dawn is still hours away. I'm writing this on my phone, hoping someone finds it, hoping someone believes it. If you're reading this and you're planning a camping trip near Orlando, especially around Wekiwa Springs, please reconsider. And if you find yourself in a dive bar called The Swamp, and the locals start giving you warnings about staying on marked trails, run. Run as far and as fast as you can. Because the faceless ones are real, they're hungry, and thanks to the twisted arrangement with the locals, they never go hungry for long. Why'd I think I could outrun my own stupid decisions? That's the question gnawing at me now, stuck replaying how I landed in this mess. Name's Thane Jericho Voss, 34, born and bred in Boise, Idaho. I'm a mechanic, grease-stained hands, buzzed black hair, hazel eyes that V seen too many late nights. 6'2", built like I could lift an engine block, but lately, I've been running on fumes. Life in Boise was steady. Fixed trucks, drank beer, avoided drama, but steady got boring. So, I hitched up my RV trailer, a beat-up old Airstream I'd patched together myself, and rolled out of town looking for something louder. I'd been itching to shake things up for a while. Shop was slow, my buddies were settling down, and I'd just dodged a fling with a bartender who kept texting me cryptic poetry. Nah, I'm good. Saw a post online about Orlando's Lake Eola Park. Figured Florida's chaos might jolt me awake. Planned to camp nearby at Moss Park, close enough to dip into the city, far enough to breathe. Loaded the trailer with tools, a fishing rod, and a cooler of IPAs, then hauled ass down I-75. Solo trip, open road, no rules, sounded like my kind of therapy. The drive was a beast, flatlands stretching forever, humidity creeping in the closer I got. Orlando hit me like a fever dream. Neon signs, palm trees, tourists everywhere. Moss Park was a quieter pocket, though, wooded, with a lake that shimmered like glass. Pulled in late, sun sinking fast, and snagged a spot near the water. The ranger, a wiry woman with a clipboard, gave me a nod and a "don't feed the gators" warning. I grinned, thinking she was half joking. Set up camp quick, leveled the trailer, popped out a chair, cracked a beer. Felt like I'd won something small. The place was alive, crickets chirping, fish jumping, a warm breeze rustling the pines. I kicked back, watching the sky turn purple, and let the tension bleed out of me. Other campers were sparse, an older couple grilling a few sites over, a guy in a hammock strumming a guitar. Normal stuff, you know? I waved, they waved back, all chill. Built a fire, the crackle mixing with the lake's soft lapping, and dug into some jerky. For once, I wasn't overthinking, just soaking it in. I'd heard Orlando could get wild. Theme parks, traffic, spring break insanity. But out here, it was almost too calm. Growing up in Idaho, I'd camped plenty, lakes, mountains, the works, so this felt familiar, safe. Took a walk along the shore, boots sinking in the sand, and watched an egret stalk fish in the shallows. Back at the trailer, I sprawled on a blanket, staring at the stars through the trees. Perfect night, right? Should have been. Thing is, I didn't clock how isolated it really was. The couple's grill went quiet early, the guitar guy packed up, and suddenly it was just me and the dark. The lake reflected moonlight, but the woods around it swallowed everything else. Felt like the world shrank down to this one spot. I brushed it off, tough guy, lone wolf, all that crap, and crawled into the trailer. Locked the door, cracked a window, and crashed hard. Looking back, I should have caught the first red flag, the way the ranger's eyes lingered when she warned me. Or how the air got this weird, electric hum right before I dozed off. But nah, I was too busy playing rugged adventurer, too stubborn to see the cracks forming. By morning, I'd realized Moss Park wasn't the escape I thought it was, and I'd brought my own trouble right along with me. I woke up to a pounding headache and the trailer feeling like a damn oven. Sun was barely up, but Florida heat doesn't mess around. Sweat was already pooling under my shirt. Crawled out of bed, muttering, "Well, this is why I don't do mornings," and stumbled outside. The fire pit was cold, my chair tipped over like something knocked it, but I figured it was just wind. Lake was still, glassy, reflecting the pines like a postcard. I grabbed a coffee can, fired up my little propane stove, and tried to shake the fog out of my head. That's when I noticed the quiet, too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. Decided to fish for breakfast. Nothing beats frying up your own catch, right? Grabbed my rod and tackle, trudged down to the shore. The water was clear, but I saw these weird ripples, little swirls that didn't match the breeze. Cast my line anyway, leaning back against a stump, letting the calm settle in. Then I spotted something odd, couple of fish floating belly up near the reeds, not nibbled, just dead. Frowned, thinking maybe a gator'd gotten sloppy, but it left a sour taste in my mouth. Shook it off. Nature's messy sometimes. Fishing was a bust, no bites, just those creepy floaters, so I hiked a trail instead. Moss Park's got these winding paths, all shady with oaks and palmettos. Felt good stretching my legs, boots crunching gravel, but then I found this chunk of metal half buried by a tree, rusted, jagged, like part of an old machine. Looked out of place, so I kicked at it, curious. Nearby, some roots were torn up, dirt fresh, like something been digging. My mechanic brain kicked in. Maybe a busted mower from the Rangers? Still, it bugged me, that nagging little itch you can't scratch. Back at camp, I met the older couple, Maris and Cal, from Jacksonville. They were friendly, offered me a sausage link from their grill. We shot the breeze about camping spots, and Cal mentioned hearing weird splashing by the lake last night. Maris laughed it off, probably just a drunk tourist, but I caught Cal's frown. "You hear it too?" he asked, eyeing me. I hadn't, but now I was wondering what I'd slept through. They packed up soon after, saying they were cutting their trip short. "Weather's turning," Maris said, though the sky was clear. Felt like a dodge. Afternoon rolled in, and I tinkered with the trailer's hitch. Old habit, keeping my hands busy. That's when I found the scratches. Long, deep gouges on the side, right by the door. Not claw marks, more like something metal dragged across it. "What the hell?" I muttered, running my fingers over them. Could have been a branch, sure, but they were too even, too deliberate. My gut twisted. Something scary was starting to simmer, and I didn't like it. Decided to head into Orlando later, grab some supplies, maybe ask around about the park. Dusk hit, and I built a fire, cracking another beer. The lake looked darker now, almost oily, and that hum I'd felt last night was back, low, buzzing in my bones. Tried to ignore it, focusing on the flames, but then I saw lights. Not campfires, sharp, blue flashes deep in the woods, blinking on and off. Thought it was kids with LEDs or something, but they moved weird, too fast, too synchronized. I stood, squinting, and the hum got louder, vibrating the air. Disturbing as hell. Told myself it was nothing. Rangers testing gear, maybe, but my hands were clammy. Crawled into the trailer early, locking everything tight, and lay there, staring at the ceiling. The hum faded, but sleep wouldn't come. Kept replaying those scratches, the dead fish, Cal's weird comment. Maybe I'd hit the road tomorrow, find a new spot. Moss Park was starting to feel less like a getaway and more like a trap. And that's when I heard the first real sound. A sharp, metallic clank, right outside the trailer, like something testing the walls. That clank jolted me upright, heart slamming like a piston. I held my breath, listening hard. There it was again, a slow, deliberate scrape along the trailer's side. "Oh, hell no," I whispered, rolling out of bed, grabbing the tire iron I keep stashed under the mattress. No gun, never needed one in Boise, but this felt heavy enough to crack a skull if it came to that. The hum was back too, louder, rattling the windows. I peeked through the blinds, expecting a raccoon or some drunk camper. What I saw instead turned my blood to ice. Shapes moved out there, 3 of them, tall and thin, glinting under the moonlight like they were made of metal and shadow. Not people, not animals, just wrong, all sharp edges and jerky twitches. One was close, right by the door, its head tilted like it was listening back. My mouth went dry. I ducked low, gripping the tire iron, mind racing. Gators don't scrape metal, and drunks don't glow blue in the dark. This was horror movie level messed up, and I was smack in the middle of it. I waited, sweat beading on my neck, until the scraping stopped. Silence hit, heavy and thick, but I wasn't dumb enough to think they'd left. Crept to the back window. Nothing, just trees and that oily lake. Then a bang rocked the trailer, hard enough to tip my beer cans off the counter. I cursed, loud, and that's when the lights flared again, blue, blinding, flashing through every crack. Felt like they were probing, searching for me. I hit the floor, heart pounding, thinking, what did I stumble into? Morning felt a lifetime away, but I couldn't just sit there. Pulled on my boots, kept low, and checked the lock, still secure, but the door frame was dented now, bent inward. Whatever they were strong. I grabbed my phone, half a bar, enough to text my buddy Rick in Boise. Something screwed up here, might bolt. Sent it, praying it'd go through. Then I heard Maris's voice in my head, that dodge about the weather. Had they seen this too? Was that why they bailed? The next hit came. 2 bangs, one on each side, like they were circling. I swung the tire iron at the air, just to feel less helpless, and hissed, back off. Dumb move. They answered with a sound, this high-pitched whine that drilled into my skull. Dropped me to my knees, ears ringing, and I saw it then. One of them, up close through the window. Face wasn't a face, just a smooth plate, glowing slits where eyes should have been. My stomach lurched. This wasn't natural, wasn't even close to human. I scrambled to the driver's cab, keys shaking in my hand. Plan was simple, start the engine, haul ass out of Moss Park, never look back. But the battery was dead. Turn the key, click, nothing. You've got to be kidding me, I growled, slamming the dash. Outside, the whining stopped, replaced by a low, pulsing beat. Felt it in my chest, like a second heartbeat. Looked out, 2 of them now, standing still, staring through the windshield. The third was gone, and that scared me more. Panic clawed up my spine. I grabbed a flashlight, flicked it on. Beam caught one of their arms, all jagged and segmented like scrap metal twisted wrong. It didn't flinch, just tilted its head again. I killed the light, breath shallow, and realized the trailer was rocking, slow, steady, like they were testing how much it'd take to flip it. This was terror, pure and raw, and I was trapped in a tin can with no way out. Then the radio crackled, static, then a voice, garbled and deep. Stay inside. I froze. Was that them? Some messed up warning? My hands shook, tire iron slick with sweat, as the rocking picked up. Whatever they weren't leaving, and I had a sick feeling they'd been waiting for me all along. That radio voice, stay inside, echoed in my skull, but no way was I listening. The trailer rocked harder, metal groaning like it was gonna buckle, and I knew I had seconds before those things turned it into a coffin. I grabbed the tire iron, my flashlight, and a half-empty bottle of Jack from under the sink. You know, for courage or a Molotov if it came to that. Screw this, I muttered, kicking the back window open. Glass shattered, and I dove out, hitting the dirt with a thud that knocked the wind out of me. The night swallowed me, dark, humid, buzzing with that pulse they made. I scrambled up, boots slipping in the mud, and bolted for the trees. Heard a screech behind me, high, metallic, pissed off, and glanced back. 2 of them were on the trailer, clawing at the roof, tearing chunks off like it was tinfoil. The third? Nowhere, and that lit a fire under me. I ran blind, branches smacking my face, lungs burning, aiming for the park entrance. If I could hit the road, flag someone down, I might make it. Something crashed to my left, fast, heavy, cutting through the woods. I swung the flashlight, beam bouncing off trees, and caught a glint. Third one, closing in, all jagged limbs and glowing slits. My heart jackhammered, veered right, toward the lake, thinking water might slow it. Big mistake. Hit the shore, splashed in knee-deep, and it followed. No hesitation, slicing through like a damn shark. I swung the tire iron, connected with a clang. Felt like hitting steel, but it staggered, buying me a second. I waited out, chest heaving, and saw headlights. Real ones, not their creepy blue flashes. A pickup roared down the access road. Some late-night fisherman maybe. I yelled, waving the flashlight. Over here. Tires skidded, and a grizzled guy leaned out, shouting, "What the hell's wrong with you?" Didn't have time to explain. Heard that whine again, closer, and dove for the truck bed. "Drive," I barked, hauling myself in as he gunned it. The thing lunged, claws raking the tailgate, missing me by inches. We peeled out of Moss Park, gravel flying, and I clung to the bed, wind whipping my face. Looked back. Those blue lights blinked in the trees, watching, not chasing. My stomach churned. The driver, Hank, he said later, yelled over the engine, "You want something, man?" I laughed, shaky, and said, "Wish I was." He didn't push it, just kept driving, radio blaring some old country tune. Felt like a lifeline, that normalcy, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. Hit a gas station off 528, neon buzzing overhead. Hank stopped, eyeing me like I was a stray dog. "You good?" he asked. I nodded, sliding out of the bed, legs wobbly. "Thanks, man. Owe you one." He grunted, drove off, and I stood there, soaked, clutching the tire iron like it had saved me. Phone was dead, trailer trashed, but I was alive. Stumbled inside, begged the clerk for a charger. Plugged in, saw Rick's reply. "Get out of there, dude." Too late for that. Cops came after I called. Took my story, half believing, half not. Said they'd check the park, but I knew they wouldn't find much. Those things weren't dumb. They'd vanish, leave the wreckage for someone else to puzzle over. Clerk mentioned hearing weird noises out that way before, but nobody ever looked too hard. Orlando's got its secrets, I guess, and I tripped right into one. I was safe, sorta, but every shadow made me jump. Kept hearing that whine in my head, feeling those eyes on me. Knew I had to get back to Boise, but part of me wondered if they'd let me go that easy, or if I'd just kicked a hornet's nest that'd follow me home. The gas station's fluorescent buzz was my only anchor, standing there with a borrowed charger and a stale coffee that tasted like regret. My hands still shook, tire iron propped against the counter like some sad security blanket. The clerk, a kid with a patchy beard, kept glancing at me, probably wondering if I was going to snap. I didn't blame him. Covered in mud, smelling like lake water and fear, I looked like a guy who'd lost a fight with a nightmare. "You sure you're okay, man?" he asked again. I nodded, forcing a grin. "Yeah, just a rough night." Cops rolled back after an hour. Two of them, tired and skeptical. Said they'd found my trailer, or what was left of it. Roof caved in, walls shredded, like a tornado hit it, and nothing else. No tracks, no blood, no sign of those things. Probably vandals, one muttered, scribbling in his notepad. I wanted to laugh. Vandals with claws and glowing eyes? Sure. They asked if I'd seen anyone else out there. I mentioned Maris and Cal, but they'd already split. Cops shrugged, told me to file a report for insurance, and peeled out. Useless. I borrowed the clerk's phone to call Rick. Mine was toast. "Dude, what the hell happened?" he barked, voice crackling through the line. Told him the short version. Camping gone wrong, trailer trashed, something scary chasing me. He cursed, said he'd wire me cash to get home. Don't mess with Florida, man, it's cursed. Laughed despite myself, but it stuck with me. Hung up, staring at the parking lot, half expecting those blue lights to flicker in the distance. They didn't, but the quiet felt worse. Hank, the pickup guy, swung by later. Guess he felt bad ditching me. Offered a ride to a motel off I-4, and I took it. Crashed there, door triple locked, tire ironed by the bed. Slept like garbage, kept jolting awake, hearing that whine, seeing those metal shapes in the dark. Morning came, and I hitched a bus back to Boise, cash from Rick in my pocket. Left the trailer, the park, all of it behind. Figured I'd dodged the bullet, you know? Big mistake thinking that. Weeks later, back in Boise, I thought I was clear. Shop picked up, nights got routine. Beer, TV, pretending Moss Park never happened. Then I found it. Scratches on my toolbox, same jagged lines from the trailer. Not deep, just enough to notice. My gut sank. Checked my truck, more marks, faint, on the tailgate. No way. I breathed, heart kicking up again. Started hearing that hum at night, low, creeping through the walls. Not loud, just enough to keep me awake, wondering. Talked to a guy online, some conspiracy nut who'd camped near Orlando. He'd heard stories, weird machines, old experiments gone wrong, buried in the swamps. Said they don't let go once they lock on. Laughed it off at first, but then my neighbor's dog went missing. Found bones by the garage, small, picked clean, arranged neat. Horror hit me like a freight train. I'd brought him with me, hadn't I? Dragged that nightmare 2,000 miles home. Cops here don't buy it. Say it's stress, maybe a prank. Rick thinks I'm nuts, but he's got my back. I'm sleeping with the lights on now, tire iron close, jumping at every noise. Last night, saw a blue flash outside. Brief, gone fast. They're here, patient, waiting me out. Should have stayed in that trailer, fought harder, or never gone to Orlando at all. Worst part? I keep thinking about Hank, the clerk, anyone who crossed my path that night. If these things follow scents, trails, whatever, did I doom them to? I'm the idiot who stirred the pot, and now we're all paying for it. I should have known this place would chew me up and spit me out. That's the thought looping in my head now, looking back at how I got here. Name's Sable Marin Vossler, 27, from Flagstaff, Arizona. I'm a barista by day, wannabe poet by night. Short black hair with a streak of purple, brown eyes that catch too much, and a knack for picking fights with life. Flagstaff's all pines and crisp air, but it started feeling like a trap. Same shifts, same faces, same empty notebooks. So, I borrowed my brother's Ford F-150, loaded it with camping gear and a beat-up guitar, and pointed east for Orlando, Florida. Needed a jolt, something raw. I'd been restless for months. Pouring lattes pays the bills, but my soul was starving. Scribbled verses weren't cutting it anymore. My brother, Kai, said I was chasing ghosts. Maybe he was right, but I didn't care. Found Moss Park online. Lakeside camping, close to Orlando's buzz, but wild enough to breathe. Packed a tent, some notebooks, a cooler of cheap wine, and hit the road. Figured I'd camp a few days, strum some chords by the water, maybe write something worth reading. Sounded like a reset, you know? The drive was a blur, deserts to plains to swamps, air getting thicker every mile. Orlando greeted me with heat and chaos, billboards screaming about theme parks, traffic snarling everywhere. Moss Park was a quiet escape, though, tucked off a winding road, all cypress trees and sandy shores. Pulled in at dusk, sky bruising purple, and snagged a spot near the lake. Ranger was a bored guy with a buzz cut, handed me a map with a lazy watch for snakes. I smirked, thinking I could handle a little wildlife. Setting up the tent was a mess. I'm no pro, and the stakes kept bending in the soft ground. Finally got it standing, sweaty and swearing, then built a fire with some scavenged sticks. The lake shimmered, reflecting the last light, and I cracked a bottle of red, sipping straight from it like a classy hobo. Strummed my guitar, picking out a moody tune, and let the night settle in. Crickets hummed, a breeze rustled the trees. Felt like I'd dodged the world's noise for once. Other campers were around. A family grilling hot dogs a few sites down, a lone guy in a ball cap fishing nearby. Waved at him, got nods back, all chill. Normal folks, I figured. Took a walk along the shore, barefoot in the sand, watching the water lap at my toes. Back at camp, I sprawled by the fire, notebook open, scribbling lines about shadows and stars. Felt good, like I'd tapped into something real. Orlando's got that split personality, tourist traps and hidden edges, and out here, it leaned quiet. Growing up in Flagstaff, I'd camped tons, snowy peaks, desert nights, so this wasn't new. Just a change of scenery, a chance to shake loose. Crawled into the tent, zipped it tight, and drifted off to the lake's soft rhythm. Should have been perfect, right? But something nagged me. Even then, the way the ranger barely looked at me, like he was clocking out of more than his shift. Or how the family's laughter died quick, replaced by whispers I couldn't catch. I brushed it off, city girl nerves, I told myself, too used to Flagstaff's safe little bubble. By morning, I'd see Moss Park wasn't just a backdrop, it was waiting to show me its teeth. Waking up in that tent hit me like a hangover without the fun, sticky, sore, and muttering. Why'd I think this be poetic? The air was thick, Florida's humidity choking me as I stumbled out. Fire was dead, ash scattered, and my wine bottle had tipped over, bleeding red into the dirt. I kicked it aside, grabbed my guitar to strum the grogginess away, but the lake stopped me cold. It was too still, no ripples, no birds, just this creepy hush that made my skin crawl. I squinted at it, unease bubbling, and wondered if I'd slept through something weird. Decided to walk it off, needed words for my notebook anyway. Slung it under my arm, hit a trail, boots crunching sand and pine needles. The woods were dense, moss hanging like curtains, and I found this patch of dirt, soft, torn up, with a coppery whiff. Kneeling, I spotted tiny glass shards glinting in the mess, sharp and strange. Pocketed one, frowning, some busted art project? It stuck with me, a little too disturbing to shrug off. Back at camp, coffee was a bust, water from my jug tasted like metal, bitter enough to spit out. I cursed, switched to a bottled stash, and brewed something drinkable. Then the family rolled by, mom, dad, kids, all packed up, van loaded. Leaving so soon. I called, half joking. Dad muttered, not our vibe, avoiding my eyes as they peeled out. Mom's tight smile lingered in my head. Snakes? Bad vibes. Something had them spooked. Mid-morning, I waded into the lake. Water looked fine, despite that jug weirdness. Coolness bit my shins, calming me, and I strummed from the shore after. Felt almost normal until I saw the fisherman. Same ball cap, rod down, staring at the water like it had betrayed him. You okay? I shouted. He turned slow, eyes empty, then shuffled into the trees without a word. Chills raced up my spine. Not horror yet, just off enough to rattle me. Afternoon dragged, and I couldn't write. Restless, antsy. Took another trail, deeper, and found more churned dirt, bigger glass shards streaked with dark stains. That copper smell sharpened, alive almost, and then I heard it. A low thump, rhythmic, like the ground had a pulse. I froze, scanning the trees. Nothing, just that beat under my feet. My poet brain spun wild, but my gut said this was trouble brewing. Back at camp, I sketched the shards, trying to make sense of it. The fisherman passed again, closer, silent, pointing at the lake before vanishing. What's your deal, dude? I snapped, nerves fraying. Looked where he'd pointed. Water swirled slow, dark, like something massive stirred it. My stomach flipped. Decided I'd hit Orlando tomorrow, grab supplies, ask around, get my head straight. Night fell, and I built a fire, sipping wine to dull the edge. That thump came back, louder, syncing with my pulse, vibrating the air. Ripples spread from the lake's center. No wind, no fish, just motion. My fire flickered, shadows stretching wrong, and I caught a glint out there. Quick, sharp, like those shards catching light. My hands tightened on the guitar, unease growing. Crawled into the tent early, zipping it tight, but sleep dodged me. Kept replaying the family's rush, the fisherman's stare, that thump in my bones. Told myself it was just new place jitters. Flagstaff never threw curveballs like this. But deep down, I knew something scary was waking up out there, and I was too damn curious to bolt yet. Morning slammed me awake. Tin a sauna, head pounding like I'd downed the whole cooler. I crawled out, muttering, this better get good soon, and froze. The fire pit was wrecked, rocks scattered, ash smeared in streaks, like something dragged through it. My guitar lay tipped over, strings buzzing faintly. No wind could have done that. I scanned the lake, still dark, swirling slow, and my stomach knotted. Something horror-worthy was starting, and I was too stubborn to admit it yet. Grabbed my notebook, needing to move, and hit the trail again. That copper smell was thicker now, stinging my nose, and I found more glass. Chunks, not shards, some crusted with black gunk. Then I saw it. A footprint in the mud, too big, toes splayed weird, like nothing human. My breath hitched. What the hell? I whispered, snapping a pic with my phone. The thump came back, stronger, shaking the ground, and I bolted back to camp, heart racing. The fisherman was there when I got back, standing by my tent, staring at the lake. Hey, I yelled, voice cracking. He turned, eyes sunken, and pointed again, slow, deliberate. I followed his arm. Something breached the water, just for a second, long and slick, then sank. My skin crawled. He shuffled off, silent as ever, and I grabbed my knife. A little pocket blade, more for show than fight. Felt dumb, but it steadied me. Tried to pack up, screw poetry, I'd had enough, but my hands shook too bad to fold the tent right. That's when the water rippled hard, waves lapping the shore, and I saw it again, taller this time, glistening, with arms that didn't bend right. Horror hit me like a truck. Dropped the tent poles, grabbed my phone, 3 bars, and texted Kai. Something's wrong here, might bail. The thump pulsed louder, in my chest now, and I knew I wasn't imagining this. Afternoon blurred into panic. Decided to hike to the ranger station. Needed help, a signal, anything. Halfway there, I found the family's site. Empty, but their cooler was smashed, hot dogs strewn like bait. My gut twisted, kept moving, and the thump turned into a growl. Low, wet, echoing through the trees. Looked back. Nothing, but the air felt alive, pressing on me. This wasn't snakes or a bad trip. This was terror, real and closing in. Made it to the station, door ajar, no ranger. Inside was trashed, maps torn, radio sparking, like a fight went down. Hello. I called, voice thin. No answer, just that growl again, closer. My knife felt useless, but I gripped it anyway. Peeked out, saw it fully now, by the lake. Tall, slimy, arms dangling, head cocked like it heard me. Yellow eyes locked on mine, and I ducked, breath shallow, praying it'd pass. It didn't. Heard it slosh closer, slow, deliberate, water dripping loud. My phone buzzed, Kai's reply, get out now. Too late. The growl rattled the walls, and I saw its shadow stretch across the window, long, warped, wrong. I crouched behind the desk, heart slamming, knife shaking in my hand. This thing wasn't just disturbing, it was hunting, and I'd walked right into its game. Darkness fell fast, and I stayed put, barely breathing. The thump synced with its steps now, each one shaking dust from the ceiling. I peeked again. 2 of them, one by the station, one at the lake, moving like they knew I was trapped. My mind screamed run, but my legs wouldn't budge. Whatever this was, it was beyond scary. It was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, and it wasn't letting go. I couldn't stay crouched behind that desk forever. My legs burned, and that growl was drilling into my skull. Move, Sable, now. I hissed, gripping my knife like it'd actually do something. The shadows shifted. Those things were circling, one sloshing closer, its yellow eyes glinting through the cracked window. I bolted for the back door, shoving it open, and ran into the night. Air hit me. Wet, sour, choking, and I sprinted blind, trees clawing my arms, heart slamming like it had burst. The lake was my only shot, maybe water'd slow him down. I hit the shore, splashing in, cold biting my thighs, and heard it. Wet thuds behind me, fast. Glanced back. One was in the water, arms slashing, closing the gap. I swung my knife, wild, and caught its arm. Blade sparked off slimy skin, useless. It screeched, a sound that froze my blood, and I stumbled deeper, praying for a miracle. Something roared, a real engine, not their growls. Headlights cut through the dark, a jeep skidding down the access road. I waved my phone's flashlight, screaming, help. Tires crunched gravel, and a woman yelled, get in. I lunged, water dragging at me, and that thing swiped. Claws grazed my calf, hot pain flaring. I scrambled into the passenger seat, slamming the door as she floored it, tires spinning us out of there. She was a local. Rhea, she said, voice tight. What the hell was that? I panted. No clue, just drive. The rear view showed it. 2 of them now, standing at the shore, eyes glowing, not chasing. My leg throbbed, blood soaking my jeans, but I was alive, for now. Rhea muttered about lake freaks, said she'd heard rumors, but never believed him. I laughed, shaky, clutching my knife like a lifeline. We hit a main road, 528, civilization close, and I caught my breath, adrenaline crashing. Rhea dropped me at a diner, neon buzzing, promising to call someone. I limped inside, dripping wet, and slumped in a booth. Waitress gawked but brought coffee, and I texted Kai again. Made it out, barely. Phone buzzed, his reply. Stay put. I'm coming. Too late for regrets, but they hit hard anyway. Cops showed up, took my story, tent left, ranger gone, lake monsters. They smirked, called it swamp fever. But Rhea backed me up, said she'd seen it too. They promised to check Moss Park, but I knew those things vanish. Too smart to get caught. My calf stung, a jagged cut I'd need stitches for, and I kept replaying that screech, those eyes. Horror clung to me, sticky and real. Rhea stayed, till Kai's ETA, she was shaken but solid, said Orlando's got dark corners nobody talks about. I nodded, numb, sipping coffee that tasted like ash. Outside, headlights flashed normal, human, but every shadow made me flinch. I'd escaped, sure, but it felt temporary, like those things were just biding their time, waiting me out. Bus rolled in at dawn, Kai's ride from a connecting flight. I hobbled out, leg bandaged by a diner medic, and he hugged me fierce. "You're an idiot," he growled, but his eyes were scared. I laughed, bitter, and climbed aboard, leaving Moss Park behind. Thought I'd dodged the worst, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The bus ride out of Orlando was a haze. Kai fussing over my leg, me staring out the window, half expecting those yellow eyes in every shadow. "You're done with solo trips," he said, bandaging my calf with supplies from a gas station stop. I smirked, too tired to argue, but the diner coffee sat sour in my gut. My notebook was gone, left in the tent with my guitar. Poetry drowned in that lake, along with whatever sanity I'd brought. Horror lingered, a weight I couldn't shake. Back in Flagstaff, I crashed at Kai's place. Couldn't face my apartment yet. Stitches itched under gauze, and sleep was a joke. Every creak had me grabbing my knife. Now a permanent bedside buddy. Cops called, found my gear, trashed, no sign of the ranger or those things. "Probably kids," they said. I snorted. "Kids don't claw metal or screech like that." Rhea texted too, said Moss Park was quiet now, but she wasn't buying the calm. Days blurred. Work wouldn't take me back till I healed, so I sat, staring at blank pages. Then I saw it, glass shard in my jacket pocket, streaked black from that trail. My hands shook, dropping it like it burned. That night, the thump started, faint, under the floor, like it had followed me 2,000 miles. Told Kai. He blamed pipes, but his eyes said he didn't believe it. Something scary was rooting in me, and I'd brought it home. Went online, found whispers about Orlando's lakes, old stories of things nobody named. One guy, an ex-camper, said they mark you, track you. Laughed it off, till I found scratches, faint, on my doorframe, same jagged lines from the tent. Panic clawed my throat. Checked the truck, more marks, on the tailgate. No way. I breathed, pulse racing. That thump grew, nightly, a heartbeat I couldn't escape. Kai dragged me to a dock, thought I was cracking up. Prescribed pills I didn't take, this wasn't in my head. Then Rhea called. Voice tight, said her dog vanished, bones left neat by her porch. "You see anything?" she asked. I lied, said no, but guilt gnawed me. Had I spread this? That shard, that lake. I'd poked something awake, and it wasn't just after me anymore. Nights got worse. Thump loud now, shadows stretching wrong. Saw it once, a glint outside, yellow eyes low to the ground. Froze, knife in hand, waiting, but it vanished. Kai's girlfriend moved out, said the house felt off. He stayed, stubborn, but I saw him flinch at noises too. My fault. All of it. I'd run to Orlando for a spark and drag back a curse instead. Cops here shrug, say it's coyotes, stress, whatever. I know better. Keep the lights on, check locks, but it's pointless. They're patient, waiting. Last night, Kai found glass in the yard, sharp, black-streaked, like mine. His face went pale. "What did you do, Sable?" he whispered. Didn't answer, couldn't. I'd made the deadly mistake of thinking I could outrun it. Now, we're both trapped. Me, Kai, maybe Rhea too. I hear that growl in my dreams, feel those eyes on my back. Should have stayed in Flagstaff, safe and bored. Instead, I lit a match in the dark, and whatever's out there's coming to collect, slow, sure, and hungry as hell.